Welcome to the second edition of the PCFL Show. Today we're going to talk about recruiting. This coming weekend we're playing our second national championship game between Texas and Ohio State. And then soon after that we will go into recruiting, and we'll use the same process. It'll be about 3 or 4 weeks of recruiting, and it will only be recruiting. We won't be doing anything else during that time, just like last season. We'll start with 5 stars, and then the second week 4 stars, and then the third week all the rest of the recruiting. And it will be the same basic process. Teams will have human coach teams will have 100 points each. But part of what I want to talk about today is the recruiting for the CPU teams. The first time around we just pretty much replenished the CPU teams with the same players they lost, but they were freshmen instead of seniors. That seemed like an easy fix, but it had a problem that would have been developing over several seasons. It would have made, here's the problem. There was no real way of adjusting them back to being freshmen. We couldn't really estimate how many points would have to be reduced in the actual ratings to undo 4 training camps. So they just went in the way they did with the ratings they had as seniors. But if you do that every season and then they get additional training camps, the CPU teams would get restocked with those players, and the CPU teams would end up getting close to maxed out in training camp because the freshman players would be replaced with seniors that were rated like seniors. And I realized that was a problem, so we had to create a different process. The CPU teams will still get their base of, as intended, 2 4 stars and the rest 3 stars, but they'll be replenished with a list of freshmen who will not have 4 training camps already under their belt for their ratings. And the CPU teams will sign those players. It'll keep the CPU teams competitive. And we voted on this and passed it, a wrinkle in that the CPU teams would get to bid on 1 5-star player with a 45-point bid. So if a CPU team signs one of those 5-star players, then that's 1 less player they'll get because they'll get that 5-star instead. The CPU teams will be maintained at a roster of 53 players. CPU teams are not going to get players put on the practice squad, nor do they get the ability to declare 5 redshirt freshmen who, if they don't play more than 4 games, will retain that redshirt status. Those are features and benefits reserved for human coach teams. That's kind of a built-in small reward for a team being actively coached by a human being. We did have one team that was CPU coached at the beginning of the season before that person joined. That's why that team did not end up processing or receiving declared red shirts other than what was put on practice squad if they signed players who were true freshmen. Now, after we finish recruiting, the remaining recruits that are walk-ons, they will be regular freshmen. They do not get red shirt status. The red shirt status is reserved to the players that are recruited during the normal recruiting process and then are either put on an IR slot, which is practice squad, or one of those 5 declared redshirt players that get redshirt status, again, providing they don't play more than 4 games. So the one thing that will be done, and we're going to kind of do this on somewhat a community basis, and that's why I'm asking everyone who's willing to help. I'm going to send out the teams a recruiting file, and it will have the list of which positions the CPU teams will recruit and their proposed priority. I'm asking all human coaches to offer their input, take it, maybe look at a couple teams and maybe look at all 8 or 9 of the CPU teams and offer their input as to whether or not they think those priorities are correct, or those teams should maybe recruit a wide receiver or a cornerback with their first pick or whatever, because that is what will determine what players they get, and basically it will determine which 5-star player the CPU team puts a 45-point bid on, and then if they receive that player, their second and third players will be 4-star players, and so on. And then the rest would be 3-star players. It will determine how many 4 and 3-star players are created for those CPU teams. The other thing I'm going to look at before releasing the final, if there are any adjustments needed, that is the number of 5-stars. I know the original recruiting pool was calculated, I believe it was like 10% of the players would be 5-stars, so it was something like 21 out of 210 or something like that. And I will look at, because now we have CPU teams recruiting 5-stars. We don't want more 5-stars than we need. We don't want to inflate the talent, but we want to have the correct number. So if we have fewer than that 21 or 23, I know it was one of those two numbers that was in the first recruiting pool. That was the proper number for 18 teams. Now I know we recruited 9 teams out of 18 or whatever. So the first recruiting pool was a little bit stronger than it should have been for the number of teams actively participating in it. So whatever that number is 21 or 23 5-stars spread out among 18 teams. Since the CPU teams are recruiting 5-stars, then we will have that number of 5-star players in the recruiting pool. And the CPU teams will put in a 45-point bid that will be placed on the forum. I'll place those on the forum before recruiting for 5-stars opens. And the way that will work is, if a human coach team wants to, it's a one-time bid. The CPU teams can't place additional bids. They place the one bid for one player at 45 points. If that stands, they sign that player and receive that player. If it doesn't stand, the human coach teams can then place unlimited bids. So if I bid 46 points on a 5-star wide receiver that a CPU team is bid on, Ohio State bids 46.5 and Arkansas bids 47, so on, then that would be a normal recruiting battle that takes place after that. That CPU team doesn't receive that player because they got outbid. Now, if another CPU team puts a 5-star bid on a defensive end and no one bids on that player, that CPU team receives that bid. So after I post this show on the YouTube channel, and I'll be sending out the teams and recruiting files so you can all take a look at the recruiting plan. Now keep in mind, those players, other than the 5-stars, those players do not come out of our pool of players. The CPU teams are going to have their own pool of players that will be sufficient only to fill the number of spots they need to get back to 53 players. That's all we're filling in the CPU teams. 53 player rosters, just like they started with. But unlike the old way of just replenishing with changing the seniors to freshmen, we're putting actual freshmen in who are rated as freshmen, haven't had those, next 4 training camps. And they'll be generally repleted with the same positions. So if a CPU team lost a quarterback, 2 wide receivers, a running back, so on, they'll receive freshmen the same number in those positions. The only other adjustments I may make is if a CPU team, say, had 3 fullbacks, and most teams only need 1, then they'll get halfbacks instead of fullbacks. The computer, when it drafted the teams initially, drafted more fullbacks to teams than we normally will draft. But other than that, if a CPU team loses 2 linebackers, they'll get 2 freshman linebackers to replace them. If they lost a quarterback and a defensive end, they'll get those replaced. So that's pretty much how that's going to work. And then before recruiting starts, the CPU teams will bid on those 5-star players, and then when it's determined which 5-star players they receive, then it will be determined how many. All the CPU teams will get 2 4-star players that will be generated for the CPU teams for the positions that they need them at. And then they'll get the rest of them filled with fairly standard 3-star players, like most of the players that we recruited in the 3rd phase of recruiting when we recruited 3-star players. And that will repopulate the CPU teams. We will recruit from the pool of recruits that was sent out will recruit, competing against, possibly outbidding the CPU teams, the 5 stars the first week, and then the second week, starting Friday at midnight Eastern time, just like we did last season. The second week we'll recruit from the 4 stars, and then the third week we'll recruit from everyone that's left, which will basically be 3 stars, because in the previous round, as happened last season, probably all the 4-star players will be signed. So what will be left will be 3 stars and lower. So the third week of the recruiting process, we will recruit from them. So that's what I wanted to outline in the show, and the reason why we're doing it and how this is going to work. So we don't, this is, I think, the best balanced way we could find to replenish the CPU teams with freshman players and keep them competitive, but not necessarily recruit better than we should be recruiting for our human coach teams. But also, there's no way for, I mean, it works when we do training camp that a few of us volunteered and did training camps for CPU teams, because you can do a training camp, but it doesn't make sense. It's kind of a conflict of interest and doesn't really work for each of us to like adopt 2 or 3 CPU teams and then recruit for them, because then we're bidding for our own team, we're bidding for the CPU teams against ourselves, and that just doesn't work. It really wouldn't be workable. So I knew we couldn't do that. We had to come up with a way to replenish and maintain these CPU teams at a competitive level without them the other way. If the players are just simply replenished and the seniors are turned into freshmen, and there'd be like an accumulation of ratings from successive training camps where those CPU teams would end up having monster rosters that would look almost like PCFL teams competing against our college level PCFL teams. You can see where that wouldn't work. The CPU teams are competitive, more than competitive enough as it is with the PPPs that they're using. We wouldn't want it to get to the point where the CPU teams would dominate the league to the extent that talent level has that much of an effect over coaching, which I think it does have some. If, you know, those CPU teams are all maxed out, got to the point where they're maxed out in their player ratings, that would make them too strong, at least as far as roster talent. And given that we look at this year, I'm hoping this season that we will all become even better at beating CPU teams. And we had 8 teams made the playoffs, and 4 of them, or 3 of them, were CPU teams. 1 of them was a team that was human coached but using CPU PPPs. So I'm hoping this season at least 6 or 7, maybe all 8 of those playoff spots will be awarded to human coach teams that beat enough of the CPU teams in order to finish in the top 8 in the league rankings that decide which 8 teams go to the playoffs. So that's what I wanted to address in this second PCFL show. Good luck to Justin coaching Texas and Barney coaching Ohio State in this coming week's second PCFL National Championship. If both teams are able to get their PPPs in by late Thursday night, I can run and record the game either late Thursday night or early Friday morning, and we'll be able to stream it on Discord on Friday Night Lights before the PNFL games begin. If not, we will stream it sometime Saturday night at a time when at least both the coaches involved can join us and watch the game. So we'll do it one or the other. And otherwise, good luck in the game. And the next time this issues are addressed, I'll do another PCFL show to address it. Thanks for listening. And thanks for participating in the PCFL.